Have you ever walked away from a conversation and then found your mind replaying it later? You might start analysing every little thing that you said, wondering if you came across the wrong way, thinking about someone's tone or something they said or how they may have perceived you. Sometimes the mind starts asking questions like, did I say too much? Did that sound strange? Have I upset them? And before you know it, you're mentally reviewing the whole interaction again. And for some people, this goes on for hours, sometimes even days. Now, what can be really frustrating is that you often know that you're overthinking, but your mind keeps doing it anyway. Hello, I'm Rebecca, and welcome to my podcast When Insight Isn't Enough. In this episode, we're exploring why the mind sometimes keeps replaying conversations. And this happens even when we consciously know that it isn't helping. So many thoughtful, self aware people experience this pattern. They tend to be reflective, empathetic, and very aware of how their behavior affects others. Now, ordinarily, these are wonderful qualities, but when the nervous system is under pressure, that awareness can turn into hyper awareness or hypervigilance. The mind begins scanning interactions for anything that may have gone wrong. So you may notice this pattern happening most often in certain situations. For example, perhaps after a difficult conversation, or if you've met someone new, or after expressing a strong opinion. It's generally after a moment when you may have felt emotionally exposed or vulnerable. Now, sometimes it even happens after a completely normal interaction. You leave the conversation, and later that evening, your mind begins replaying it. Now, often this happens when things finally become quiet, perhaps when you're driving home or when you're lying in bed or when the day slows down and your mind finally has space to wander. Now, from a psychological perspective, the brain is constantly monitoring something very important, and that's social safety. Human beings are wired for connection. For most of our evolutionary history, belonging to a group was absolutely essential for survival, and being rejected from the group could mean danger. So the brain evolves systems that pay close attention to signals of acceptance, rejection, or conflict. Now, when the nervous system is under pressure, those systems become far more sensitive. Research on rumination suggests that when the brain senses this uncertainty with a social interaction, it often tries to resolve that uncertainty by analysing the event. It's almost like the mind is playing a review process. Did that go okay? Did I say something wrong? What did they mean by that tone? Now, often our mind believes that if it thinks about a situation for long enough, it will be able to prevent a future problem. But of course, if you've experienced this, you know that most of the time that doesn't actually solve anything. Instead, it just keeps the mind stuck in loops. Now, sometimes this pattern shows up in the form of reassurance seeking. I remember working with a client who would often talk to her husband about interactions she'd had with friends or with work colleagues. And then she'd be telling him about it and she'd ask him questions like, do you think what I said was okay? Do you think they were offended? Why do you think they might have said XYZ? And anyway, he would listen to her and he would reassure her. He would tell her that everything sounded fine. But that reassurance only helped for a really short period of time. Before long, her mind would start analysing the conversation again. She'd start replaying it, and all those questions would return. Now, this is actually a very, very common pattern. Now, when the system is under internal pressure, reassurance can feel calming in the moment, but it rarely settles the deeper response, and that's what's driving this anxiety. So the mind keeps returning to the same loop over and over again. Now, one of the ways that I explain this pattern is through what I call an internal pressure model. So over time, subconscious beliefs, unprocessed emotional experiences, and conditioned stress responses can build beneath the surface. Now, together, they create internal pressure within the mind and the nervous system. So, when that pressure is present, the brain becomes more vigilant. It scans social interactions for potential problems. And social interactions are one of those places that this pressure often shows up. So the mind begins replaying conversations, and in effect, you're trying to regain a sense of certainty or control. So, this is also why insight alone rarely stops the pattern. You might logically know that the conversation was fine. You might even tell yourself, oh, look, don't worry, stop thinking about it. But if the nervous system is still holding that pressure, then the mind keeps looping because the system still believes that there is something important to resolve. So, this isn't simply a thinking problem, it's a deeper pattern within the system. Now, what was interesting with that particular client was that after we've been working together for a little while, the pattern changed. One day she mentioned that her husband had actually said to her, you know, you stopped asking me all of those questions after you see your friends. Now, she hadn't even realized that she'd stopped. And the pattern had just simply faded. So, what often happens is that when the deeper pressure in the system begins to settle, the mind no longer feels like it needs to keep reviewing every social interaction. People often describe their mind becoming quieter, they feel more peaceful. Conversations happen and then they move on. They don't give it a second thought. They don't feel that same urge to analyze every detail afterwards because the nervous system no longer feels like it needs to stay alert. And as that internal pressure settles, people often find themselves feeling more relaxed in social situations, and they're actually able to be more present, to enjoy it, and they're less preoccupied with how they might be perceived. They're able to engage in conversations naturally without the same little voice in their head giving them that internal commentary afterwards. If you recognize this pattern in yourself, look, just know that you are certainly not alone. Many thoughtful, reflective people experience this, and it's very possible to change these patterns when we begin working with the deeper responses that are driving them. Thank you for listening to When Insight Isn't Enough. If this topic resonates with you, you're very welcome to explore my work through my website.